The two words in the name of this podcast, Discernment Digest, do each provide the two goals of every episode, namely to provide first a summary, a digest of recent events, and seek to model thinking about them in a discerning way, and then secondly, to offer some teaching that sets our current milieu in historical and biblical context. The military attack on Iran 2 days ago, the State of the Union last Tuesday, and the Supreme Court ruling just under 2 weeks ago all have something very important in common regarding our system of government and the beliefs that underlie that system. You see, all of them highlight the amassing of presidential power over Congress and the attempt at least to weaken the power of the courts as it relates to the office of president. Now, I'll explain how that is in a bit, but first, let's just be reminded that our governmental structure is one that's born in reaction to the powers of a government that imposed taxes on the colonies by fiat and without representation of those colonies in the government making the imposition. Remember, no taxation without representation were the watchwords of the American Revolution. For a decade prior to our Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the Revolutionary War that ensued, the colonists had chafed under the onerous and the capricious actions of the British government and her King George, prompting Thomas Jefferson to list a host of grievances in the Declaration, among them saying that the king has, quote, combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, and then lists some of those: for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. Now, those are just a sampling of the abuse of power that precipitated the revolution, resulted in the war, and gave rise to the adoption of our governmental charter, the U.S. Constitution, at the Continental Congress in 1787. From October of that year until May of the following, for several months, 7 in particular, 3 amazing statesmen, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, interacted in a series of essays addressing various components of the Constitution, and they were doing so for the people of New York in particular to persuade them to vote for the ratification of the Constitution, as the consent of the states was a requirement. Those 85 essays are amazing, and they are called the Federalist Papers, and they are numbered. In Federalist number 47, Madison, the principal architect of the Constitution itself, wrote this: "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." And this is why, Madison explained, this new Constitution was so layered with checks and balances that would keep the executive branch and its chief executive, the president, from becoming too powerful by, among other things, not allowing him to allocate spending from the Treasury, giving the Congress the exclusive right to declare war, allowing the Congress to impeach and remove from office, and so on, and to keep the Congress, the legislative branch, in check. Their statutes require the signature of the president to become law. The president appoints those who will serve in the executive branch. The Congress is bicameral with a House of Representatives and a Senate that check each other as each needs the other to pass laws. And it checks the judiciary by requiring all federal judges to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, but giving those approved a measure of independence by making their appointments for life, and so not subject to popular vote, and their pay cannot be reduced by Congress as a way to force their hand. There are many other such layers and checks and balances, and it is, frankly, an ingenious system, one that has served us amazingly well for nearly 240 years, but it is always facing threats, and it does so today in, I think it's fair to say, some unprecedented ways by our presidents. Now, of the need for checks and balances, Madison wrote in what is perhaps the most well-known of the Federalist essays, Federalist number 51, he said, "It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself." Now notice the view of human nature that's inherent here. It assumes the very real susceptibility of human nature to harm of others, to what we Christians would call sin, and they needed a structure. And after all, that's what a constitution is. It is a structure to keep humans in check. Richard Hofstadter, who's not a Christian nor a conservative, he wrote in his book, The American Political Tradition, quote, "The founding fathers looked to their own Christian heritage for the idea of original sin, and they found confirmation of the notion that man is an unregenerate rebel who has to be controlled. They were inordinately confident that they knew what man always had been and what he always would be. Private vices could be public benefits. An economically beneficent result would be providentially or naturally achieved if self-interest were left free from state interference and allowed to pursue its ends." He's saying that not only did the political system rely on a dim view of human nature, so did and does our economic system. The truth is, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in the same year as our Declaration in 1776, it assumes greed, that people will produce more than they need, but if harnessed, this will benefit the country as a whole. And I would say that over time, that has certainly proven to be the case. We have such a high standard of living in part because of that recognition of human nature and harnessing it for economic benefit. Now, I said our system has recently been under threat by our presidents, but we've had threats of congressional overpowerment when, for example, the New Deal in the 1930s and 40s and the Great Society in the 1960s and all of the legislation that was passed under FDR and LBJ, it meant elected officials, though, in Congress were passing laws to give money to citizens in ways unheard of in the past, with things like Social Security and Medicare, which most Americans, conservative or liberal, progressive, whatever, most now support. But in what was also what became what we sometimes call the administrative state. The more conspiratorial among us call it the deep state. I prefer administrative state. It's just how large the government has become over the last 80 years or so. And this is partly why you had only one party controlling the House of Representatives for 4 decades. From 1954 to 1994, the Democratic Party controlled the House of Representatives. That was the party of FDR. That was the party of LBJ. And the courts had their heyday of power, perhaps most pronounced during the Chief Justiceship of Earl Warren and the Warren Court's activism in the minds of many, usurping the power of Congress and making law rather than merely interpreting it in things like school busing imposed in the 1970s and, of course, 1973, and the infamous Roe v. Wade abortion decision, striking down all of the abortion laws in all 50 states by judicial decision. Now, in the last couple of decades, there have been many conservative justices appointed to the federal bench, including the Supreme Court, who have reversed much of it, causing those on the other side to accuse the conservatives of the very judicial activism we decried for so long. I would encourage you all to just consider whether reversal of activism is itself activism, though. So what does all of that have to do with the State of the Union, with the Iran attack, and with tariffs? Well, the spectacle that is now the State of the Union has gradually become so since the time over 100 years ago that Woodrow Wilson decided to communicate the State of the Union by a personal appearance before Congress. When he did that in 1913, it had not been done since our very first president, George Washington. Well, it's only grown in its drama and, frankly, silliness over the decades. But like so many trappings of the presidency, it only serves to enhance the office of one person. And it's not required by the Constitution at all, which only says this, quote, "The president shall, from time to time, give to the Congress information of the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient." The truth is that could just be done in a letter, and it need not even be annual every year. And for, as I said, all those years up to Woodrow Wilson, it was done by letter. So, okay, the power of the president has greatly increased since World War II, and with America as the sole superpower after World War II, or I should say, along with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and now for the last several decades as the sole superpower. And if we don't love the State of the Union, we can just not watch, which was my choice this year, and it has been, unfortunately, for several. But there is the attack on Iran, which was undertaken, and as are nearly all of our military actions these days, undertaken by unilateral decision of the president without consent of Congress. But you may recall I said that earlier the Constitution gives to Congress the exclusive right to declare war. Well, that is true, and I think it's been since World War II that Congress has done that explicitly. Now, just after 9/11 in 2001, Congress did pass something called the Authorization for Use of Military Force, AUMF, but made it subject to the decision of the president for how long the AUMF would be needed, and guess what? It was deemed to be needed for over 2 decades. It was not repealed just until 2 years ago in 2023, 3 years ago, excuse me. Now, the Constitution says that the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So under that provision, presidents of both parties have bypassed congressional approval for war. In the case of Iran, you may recall just a few months ago, we bombed their nuclear facilities and, according to the administration, quote, obliterated their capability. But apparently not so, because part of the reason for this attack is their nuclear capability. And then there are the tariffs, which the Congress gives exclusively the right to impose tariffs to Congress. But a Congress that from time to time passes emergency powers for the president, that they issue legislation that grants power to the president. They did so in 1977 in an emergency powers law for the president that gave him powers in the case of an invasion, Powers that did not, by the way, mention tariffs at all. But President Trump has declared an emergency because of the invasion of foreign goods and money, but the court said he overstepped his power in this most recent decision. Now, the court did the same with Joe Biden and his attempt to forgive school loans, blanket forgiveness of school loans, because he declared an emergency during and well after COVID that he said required intervention in the economy, including forgiving those school loans. And the Supreme Court struck him down. President Trump has invoked emergency power for a number of things, including sending the military into some of our states because of an immigration emergency. And now the administration is talking about, I must say ominously, overseeing and possibly overtaking the next federal election in November of this year due to a supposed emergency. We will see if they, in fact, attempt that. So the courts did and will weigh something called the non-delegation doctrine when they look at these attempts by the chief executive, no matter who they are that's in power. Currently, it's President Trump, obviously, but they'll weigh what's called the non-delegation doctrine. That is, that Congress cannot delegate its constitutionally given powers to the president. And so when they give these emergency powers, the courts have to look carefully at whether or not Congress are actually giving away what the Constitution says they're supposed to do. And they'll also weigh a doctrine called the major questions doctrine. The idea is that on major questions like the imposition of tariffs, like the overseeing of elections, if indeed it comes to that, Congress has to be explicit in what it is allowing the executive to do in these areas of major question. Whoever the president is, it is a grace of God when he or she is kept in check. Because, as Madison rightly suggested, rulers are not angels and therefore cannot be allowed to govern as kings. Now, remind me sometime to talk about how Richard Nixon was much more respectful of these issues than, say, Bill Clinton was or Donald Trump is. On one of our episodes, we'll get into that. All right, that's a digest of some things that have been happening and yet how, from a Christian standpoint, biblical standpoint, with regard to what the Bible teaches about human nature and sin, we could perhaps and should perhaps look at those. I said last week in the next few episodes, I'll attempt to make the case that in our interaction with others, the culture, with the world, that Christians have been seduced into worldliness. And that is how I believe over many decades now we have gotten to where we are. And I went back to, in that last episode, the Second Great Awakening and tried to show that that was a man-centered and method-centered approach to ministry, spurred on by a man named Charles Finney, and his methods and man-centeredness are with us in a big way to this day. It means if you're going to appeal to the audience, if you believe that, as Finney said, revival is nothing more than the correct use of means, well, then that means it depends on us if it's going to be successful. And I said that there's an overemphasis on then effectiveness over faithfulness. Well, it means then a desire to be liked, to put your best face forward, being liked by and respected by the world. And after the Second Great Awakening, in the latter part of the 19th century, the 1800s, there was a real challenge to the Bible coming from academia. And this desire to be liked reared its head. There was the challenge to the accuracy of the Bible and the trustworthiness of the Bible by those who were getting education in Germany in particular and being immersed in what's called German higher criticism. Now, criticism is often used to connote something negative. Criticism can be quite positive. It's the kind of thing we're trying to do in discerning. You're making an evaluation. You're making a judgment. And there is a kind of criticism that goes on in biblical scholarship of manuscripts, sometimes called lower criticism. And that is, it believes the Bible, it believes the trustworthiness of the Bible, but as it looks at the various manuscripts, it makes evaluations about which are older, which are more accurate, and that kind of thing. But higher criticism places the critic above the Bible. And the Bible is not given the benefit of any doubt in terms of its accuracy and trustworthiness. German higher criticism did that by just speculating about how the Bible came to be, contrary to what the Bible claims in terms of who authored it and how it came to be. For example, especially the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Bible says very clearly, Jesus affirmed himself that these are books written by Moses, which then gives us the time frame in which they were written, if indeed they were written by Moses, as they were. But German higher criticism came up with the JEDP, documentary hypothesis, it's sometimes called. J for the Jehovah writer. That is, that in those first 5 books, some sections use the name for God of Yahweh or Jehovah most often. That's one writer. There's the Elohim writer for some sections. There's the Deuteronomist who wrote the 5th of the books of Moses, and then the priestly writer. According to them, these can't be the same guy. They can't be Moses. They are 4 different authors, and we don't know who those authors would be. But that was the hypothesis of the German higher critics, and it was bought into by those who were educated there, brought back to seminaries here in America, and was taught for many decades, still is, in variations of that same kind of criticism taught today in liberal seminaries. And so it was a real challenge to the Bible. And then there was challenging the Bible on the issue of science. At that same time, in fact, 1859, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species was published. And so in answer to all of that, at the turn of the century, there was a movement called fundamentalism. The idea was to get back to the fundamentals of the faith in contrast to the liberal excursions into higher criticism and into denying God's 6-day, 24-hour creative activity as the Bible presents it. And so there was the publication between 1910 and 1915 of the Fundamentals. And the subtitle was A Testimony to the Truth. It was a 12-volume set, and it contained 90 essays defending biblical doctrines. It was financed by some wealthy Christians, Baptists, by the way, Lyman and Milton Stewart. They were California oil men, and they were the founders of a Union Oil Company, Union 76 gas stations. We don't have many of them around here in southeast Michigan, but many of you remember back when we did have a lot of those, and they still exist in other parts of the country. But, you know, in those days, with the challenge to science, for example, we didn't have some of the organizations that we've been blessed by, frankly, over a number of decades now. Creation Research Institute out of San Diego, the Answers in Genesis group in northern Kentucky, Creation Ministries International in Atlanta. We at our church have had a couple of their speakers in 2018, Jonathan Sarfati, and then last year we had another one of their speakers with us as well, and benefited both times. Well, we didn't have all of that, though. Back when Darwin was in his heyday, making inroads into churches, especially into seminaries, and in order to be respectable to the world and respectable in academia, many were acquiescing to this teaching that was contrary to what the Scriptures clearly taught. And one of the famous, perhaps infamous events that occurred related to all of that was something called the Scopes monkey trial, Scopes, named for John Scopes, a biology teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, who was teaching Darwin's theory of evolution in the public schools in Dayton. And Tennessee had a law against teaching evolution. And so he was cited. He was actually convicted for that. But the trial itself, dubbed the monkey trial, was a sensation around the country for the several days that it took place. It was a sensation in part because of who the prosecuting attorney was, none other than William Jennings Bryan, a son of Dayton, Tennessee, and also a very, very well-known, famous, successful politician, not only on the local level, but the national and international level. He was a U.S. Secretary of State. He ran for president. He gave one of the most famous political speeches in history in 1896 at the Democratic National Convention. It's called the Cross of Gold speech. You could look that up. So he was a very, very well-known. He was an orator of note, and he prosecuted Scopes. The American Civil Liberties Union paid a guy to come and Clarence Darrow, a very well-known defense attorney, to come and defend Scopes. And Darrow lost the case, but he won the PR war. He was very flamboyant, he was very funny, and in some ways humiliated William Jennings Bryan, put Bryan on the stand. The case was much more favorable to the fundamentalist side, the Bible-believing side, to the Bryan side than it was portrayed by the media. And unfortunately, though, that very negative portrayal of the Bible believers in Tennessee, of William Jennings Bryan, got out there through, for example, H.L. Mencken. Mencken was a reporter for the Baltimore Evening Sun. He was a real curmudgeon, and he could not stand, his language toward the Bible believers in Tennessee and elsewhere was very vitriolic. And so we won the battle but lost the PR war, as I say. There was a book and a play written called Inherit the Wind that was about the Scopes monkey trial, again portrayed the Bible believers very negatively. Here's what Richard Kebido said about the way conservative Bible-believing people were thinking at that time. He said this: when fundamentalism emerged as a movement in the United States, it did so as a persecuted minority group. The fundamentalists rejected and were rejected by the increasingly liberal and inclusive denominations in which they had been nurtured. They tried to nourish their children and future ministers free from the corruption of the world, its values and practices. Thus, the fundamentalists believed in the Christ against culture. I won't spend much time because I'm out of time here shortly, but Christ against culture is refers to Niebuhr's taxonomy about how Christians relate to the culture. There's Christ above, Christ under, Christ beside, Christ against. But Kebido goes on to say this: the new evangelicals broke with fundamentalism in the early 40s, the early 1940s, because the world was passing them by. And they were no longer convinced that the world was that bad after all, at least not as bad as the fundamentalists had maintained. The evangelicals knew that to influence the world for Christ, they would have to gain its attention in a positive way. In a word, they would have to become respectable by the world's standards. Well, that is exactly what the new evangelicals who left the fundamentalists so that they could be respectable by the world's standards. That's exactly what they set out to do. They began publications, they started organizations, they started schools, all with that idea. And that has affected the way evangelical Christianity in America has been practiced and gone forward ever since. And it has it has evolved and devolved, really, in its desire to be respectable by the world, and in my considered opinion, has as a result become worldly. And because of that, it is a major influence in how we got to where we are. That, as I've said over the last several episodes, we must win now and win politically, win culturally. That idea goes back to this notion that the new evangelicals had. And I'm going to seek to document some of those publications, some of those schools. One school in particular has been heavily influential in all of that. We will see that next week. So if you have any questions or comments, you can, and please do, send those to discern@cbctrenton.com. I hope you can listen again next Monday, and in the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.